Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. How does a leader lead now? While the principles still apply, the techniques are changing. This webinar is brought to you by Blackford Capital in partnership with NABR, the best and brightest programs, Court Magazine, and Mish Business. Our sponsor today is Blackford Capital. My name is Gina Bryant. I'm the program manager for NABR. Before we get started, I have a few quick announcements. Today's webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit with Sherman HRCI. To receive your credit, please fill out the survey in the follow-up email later this afternoon. During our presentation today, if you have any questions or comments, please use the questions feature you see in the right-hand portion of your screen. Our moderator today is Paul Doyle, Managing Partner at Blackford Capital. Paul has held senior leadership positions for over 30 years with extensive experience in strategy and leadership identification and development. Paul has diverse business experience, including 15 years as CEO, leading manufacturing companies. I am now going to turn the floor over to Paul, and he will go ahead and introduce the rest of our panelists.
Well, good afternoon. And on behalf of all my colleagues at Blackford Capital and with the support of our partners at Corp, we're excited to spend the next hour with you today. It is one of the ongoing goals of Blackford to support the business community through a series of webinars whose purpose it is to address the more critical issues facing business today. As was just mentioned, we are going to be joined today by 3 great panelists who will help us explore the challenge of being a leader in today's remote work environment. Our hope is that we can bring you not just education about the situation, but more importantly, practical applications of what successful leaders are doing in these times. I would reiterate the request for those who are watching, even those as far away as Aloha, Oregon, to use the chat feature to send us questions as they occur to you. I think there's a wonderful irony here that we are going to be discussing how to work and connect remotely with the people and teams we lead. And I guess we'll have a chance to model a best practice in that regard. To begin, I'd like to make 2 major points. The first is that I Googled leadership this morning and it returned 3.4 billion results. So the topic of leadership is a huge topic. And it's clear that the pandemic has forced upon us changes in leadership and in particular leadership practices. I would argue that these are changes that we may have evolved to in time as the evolution between people and their relationship to work has always evolved, but the pandemic took us a quantum leap ahead. And in several cases, leaders are now rushing to catch up to those changes. The second point I would like to make is that effective leadership has always been about understanding the needs of the followers. A leader can demand compliance and generate a certain level of results, but truly effective leaders, those who have built sustainable institutions, understand that their responsibility is engagement and not just compliance. To have people fully engaged, we need to understand their needs and evolve our leadership practices to the new realities of work. As we mentioned, today we are joined by 3 panelists who have studied leaders, have implemented leadership programs, and or coached thousands of leaders in their careers. A comprehensive CV and contact information will be attached to this presentation, and you can access that at the end of the presentation, but I would like to tell you a little bit more about them to set context for their comments today. The first is Dr. Tracy Brower. She is a PhD sociologist studying work-life fulfillment. Over her career, Tracy has had the opportunity to engage with many of the Fortune 500 companies. She is currently the president of Workplace Insights for Steelcase Corporation. Previously, she was the global vice president of Workplace Vitality for M&N Mars, as well as the director of Human Dynamics and Work at Herman Miller. She is the author of Secrets to Happiness at Work and Bring Work to Life. She has been a contributing author to Forbes and Fast Company magazine. She has been featured in TED Talks, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Our second panelist today is Tom DiDonato. He is the recently retired, congratulations by the way, Senior Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer for Human Resources at Lear Corporation. In his role, he provided strategic direction and operational leadership for global human resources, and he served as a member of the company's executive council. Prior to joining Lear, Tom served as Executive Vice President of Human Resources at American Eagle Outfitters and the H.J. Heinz Company. And finally, our third panelist, Roger Price, is the founder of Leading by Design. And I find it interesting that he considers himself one part engineer, one part businessman, and many parts coach and teacher. After more than a decade as a mechanical engineer in the automotive space, Roger shifted from developing world-class automotive products to developing world-class leaders. He spent the next 20 years of his career in executive development for a variety of institutions: Prince Corporation, Johnson Controls, Twist Think, Courageous Leadership, and the Reformed Church of America. We are much appreciative to these three for joining us on today's talk. Several months ago, BlackRock Capital did another webinar titled, "Where Did All the Workers Go?" And at that session, we were investigating the labor shortage. It included in this discussion was data about the percentage of the workforce that was beginning to work remotely. This webinar picks up from that point and builds on the idea that remote is now a reality, and it's likely to be around permanently in some form or another. And this reality is changing what leaders do. So let's begin by looking at some very recent data about the work situation. While there's a lot of information on this chart, a couple things I would point out. The green elements at the top represent the fully remote work before the pandemic, at 2 points during the pandemic, an indicator of where prognosticators believe this is going to end up, and employees' preference for this type of work. So the top part is exclusively remote work. The blue elements report the same data for hybrid work arrangements, and the brown represents the fully on-site options. Perhaps the most startling piece of data on this are that only 6% of knowledge workers have a preference for working on-site, and the percentage of people working in hybrid arrangements will permanently double from pre-pandemic levels. The ramifications of this for the management of our businesses, as well as the human experience at work, are going to be significant. With that data in mind, let's set the stage for what's happening currently. And I've got a great deal of data that I'd like to share with you that will prime the pump and provide examples and data that indicate some of the unresolved matters that are challenging leaders today about remote work. It's inevitably part of the evolution that we're seeing. But the bummer of it all is that for people in the leadership world, we don't have the luxury of waiting for this grand experiment to be concluded and all the lessons learned. We still need to be acting today. So here's a couple pieces of data that present some of these challenges. The first is from a socio-political point of view. We all know that there's a lot of things in our nation that is dividing us today. Is remote work going to be another one of these great divides? The knowledge worker who works with ideas can work from anywhere on the planet. Manual workers, on the other hand, who make up more than 50% of the workforce, will never have that freedom. They're attached to a machine, to a farm, or perhaps they're employed in the service sector in jobs like restaurants and the like. And I know from my years in manufacturing that productivity and job satisfaction are always lower on the off shifts than they are on the first shift, when there is not access to the professional community to help in solving problems or driving innovation. One has to ask, will remote work make this worse? Another challenging question about the different generations is about the different generations at work and their ability to be successful in a remote environment. I guess one could ask, is this just a transition period until us dinosaurs die out and all that remains are digitally native people? But the fact is that the younger generation today, millennials and forward, are all digitally native or pretty close. However, most of the people leading them still have their VCRs flashing 12 at home. This technology divide may prevent effective communication and misunderstandings about the needs of the workers. There are lots of reports that productivity is up, and one wonders, is this a COVID bump from self-reported people who enjoy the change, or is it real and sustainable? It seems substantial from the single fact that we are saving 3.9 billion hours per year simply by the reduction in hours commuting. That's the equivalent of 1.9 million workers. On the flip side, commentary from executives at Microsoft, Apple, and Google are reporting that creativity is down. Creativity is the precursor to productivity, and if creativity is not thriving in both product and process, then eventually productivity will also decline. With the possible exception of Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Edison, creativity is a team sport, and it appears remote work makes that more difficult. There's mounting evidence about engagement and remote work. Here we see different perspectives that are somewhat difficult to reconcile. Companies are showing better retention when they have remote options, which seems like a great thing. But the most recent Gallup survey shows that engagement is at its lowest level in a decade. And the specific things this group points out that are causing the decline include a lost connection to meaning and purpose, training and learning opportunities are down, coaching and mentoring has been reduced, and people report feeling not well informed about what's going on in their company. It's an old question for leaders to ponder, but how do you show equal concern for people and productivity? The remote work question may be, how much remote time is enough for both a healthy human experience and the need to achieve business results? One of the truly interesting and positive upsides that people are reporting is that their mental health is better and that they feel better balance between work and life. Data, however, also shows that single mothers are struggling with remote work, while single men are doing much better. Younger generations want more remote, and us boomers are much less supportive. The message to me is that it appears that there's no single answer to this problem, and these sort of things are going to need to be addressed in policy and leadership direction for things like flexibility at work. Leaders are going to need to be able to assess the specific situation of employees and families and respond accordingly. Businesses are also experiencing an immediate economic value to having people work at home, and also for the longer term, to attract and retain the best people, it appears that there's going to need to be a hybrid policy that provides some flexibility. We all know that the cost of turnover in job vacancies is also a huge economic hit to businesses. It's the job of the leader to make it easier to succeed than to fail. That's a line I heard from Toyota 20 years ago. And most people report that they can get motivated and be productive at home, but there are other obstacles that need to be overcome by leaders, and this ranges from everything, including making certain that people have the right technology, the right tools, the right access to information, that working remote actually works for them in their personal life, and the work that they do does not require or value from collaboration with others. So with all this data in mind, this is an interesting concluding piece of data. When you think about the current economic environment for business and actually all institutions, you could imagine many things that would be top of mind concerns for chief executives. Silicon Valley Bank and its ripple effects, looming questions about inflation and interest rates, shortages of labor, compromised supply chains, geopolitical conflicts, And with all this going on, I find it interesting that a significant percentage of CEOs believe that the number one issue that will drive business performance is leadership. And this is where we'd like to pick up with the conversation. We mentioned that there are many dimensions and aspects of leadership, and we would like to look at three. Peter Drucker famously once said that productivity is the first test of a manager's competence. And leaders are given resources, and it's their job to get the best possible results out of these resources. So the three things we would like to focus in on first is teams and teamwork. What used to define a team in terms of people sitting around closely located cubicles is no longer the case. The second is that the intention of the leader and the growing evidence showing a need for more what has historically been called servant leadership approaches in order to be effective in working with people who are juggling so many different demands. The third is the specific question of managing for productivity. And there is evidence that productivity is up, and as we saw, some indication that creativity may be down. In all these cases, the work of the leader, what they need to do to be effective, is what we'd like to talk about in the next hour. So with that in mind, I'd like to get the panelists involved. We've got a lot of data there to tee up, so maybe a lot to unpack as we jump into the remainder of the topic. And so maybe Tracy, we could start with you. You know, one of the questions that goes around the question of team is that we have historically structured work around teams, and there's been a lot of benefit shown from the productivity of being teams, and also a lot of benefit from the human connection of having a point of connection in an organization with a team, place you can go to for support and orientation and training and mentoring. And it seems like teamwork is going to be more challenging as we move to more and more of these kind of individual contributor roles at home. What's your take on the balance between those things, and how do you see leaders building teams? You know, trust falls are out over a Zoom call. So what are we going to do to build connections and maybe work on some of the critical elements of team?
Yeah, this is a tough one. Thanks for all that background, Paul. It's such good information. You know, one of the things I think is so interesting is the research on proximity. Like, when we have a sense of proximity, that absolutely has a spillover effect in terms of engagement and motivation and productivity. But proximity can either be real or perceived. So I think leaders have this terrific opportunity to create a sense of proximity no matter where we're working. And, you know, we talked about wanting to be really pragmatic and specific about how leaders would do that. And I think one of the things we can do as leaders is to really create space for people to get to know each other on a relational basis. You know, I think the average leader is like, you know, let's get on it, let's get down to business, let's not do a lot of chit chat, let's get to our agenda. And as we're working remotely, we don't have as many serendipitous opportunities to run into each other at the coffee machine or waiting for the elevator. So that little bit of relational time that we take time for is actually really helpful to teamwork and to the effectiveness of teams. I think another thing that is really interesting when you look from a sociological perspective, it's actually a misnomer that we build teams through social activities. Of course, you know, if you've got your mixology class or your axe throwing on the calendar or your virtual Zoom happy hour, keep doing that, that's good. But a more actually productive and effective way to build teams is by bonding people through task, having people have a shared goal, roll up sleeves together, work together on something that has a shared objective. And so that's another thing that leaders can do to really build teams and build team dynamics, is to pair people and to pair groups on work where they share an objective. And I think the other thing that is worth mentioning is the importance of having people feel how their work matters and a really clear line of sight. Like, when we're sitting in our home offices, the world can get kind of small. And I think leaders have this wonderful opportunity to reinforce why we're doing and what we're doing in terms of the bigger picture and the purpose. And then also tying that back to individual work. how is my work feeding the next person and the next person on the team, and then ultimately the client or the customer or the person who benefits from our outcomes. And so reminding people about purpose, reminding people about their role and their unique contribution to purpose is also another way that we can build really healthy team dynamics and reinforce how each of us are working together with others.
Wonderful. Roger, you looked like you might have a thought on that matter.
Well, I've heard Tracy many times and seen her, and she always stirs me up with positive things. But one of the things that hit me is that, we have more tools now than we've ever had. And they might be not so natural for those of us that didn't grow up in the digital age, or as you said, native in the digital language. But I just believe that if the desire is there, and if there's humility to say, hey, maybe you could help me, I think there's a lot of tools that we've never looked at before. And again, it might not be a trust fall. Honestly, trust falls maybe have had their run already. So there are things I believe we can do from a remote area, especially if there's some hybrid also where we can come together from time to time. So anyway, some of that just stirred me up, Tracy.
Tom, one of the most significant things about a team is its ability to help develop the team members. The training that happens informally, the mentoring and things like that. And you were responsible for 160,000 people in their development at Lear Corporation. And when you think about the separation that may be occurring in a remote world, how do we bridge that previous experience of a senior person kind of looking at a junior person saying, no, I don't believe I'd have done it that way, and provide them some of the experience that where there might be pitfalls and things like that.
Yeah, look, I think you've hit on a really important challenge. It's not something that I think everybody's figured out yet, but what I like to think about, Paul, is I think development is the hallmark of any great company. And if you do a survey and you ask people how they feel, and I've never seen anything different, the top two items will always be communication, more communication, and development. Compensation will be in there, but it rarely leads. It's always more communication, more development. So development is always going to be at the forefront of any great company. I think when people are full-time remote, like software engineers or people like that, I think there's certain development things that can happen. In my opinion, if you want to have really dynamic development, typically that happens in person. People feed off of that. We've paid a lot of money to do kind of libraries of online development and training, and they're all well done. They're professionally, produced. People do not. I think the statistics are overwhelming. They don't really jump on that. There's much more happening when you have a great leader in front of a group. The group is feeding off of each other. And so for those that are in the hybrid environment, which I think is consistent with your presentation, I think that's the best way to really reach people as you develop. And you can't, as you move to more remote and more hybrid, a company cannot say, well, we don't need to spend time on that development piece, because it's very, very critical in terms of developing that affiliation that comes when people feel part of an organization, that kind of thing. So look, development is one of those things, whether you're remote or not remote or half remote or whatever, it's not going away. You have to think about it differently. I think, this is my opinion, I think you're foolish if you believe you can just all of a sudden, Zoom is now your development vessel. I think it can work in some areas, but I think the best development when you're doing, leadership training development that's not happening one-on-one, that's actually the most important. Probably better in person.
Yeah, I heard a gentleman at an event that I was at last night made the comment that in order for me to receive kind of training or coaching for somebody, that first there has to be a level of trust. And if I don't know this person, or if I only know them through Zoom, it's really hard to feel connected to that person at a trust level to kind of open the doors to mentoring and learning from them. Right?
I think there's something really important here. I've thought so much about this subject because I lived it, and it's probably the biggest change we've experienced in business in 50 years in some ways, because it's totally changed. I've been talking to many people, and I was very blessed in my career. I worked for some of the best people you could possibly work for. They shaped me. I couldn't wait to get to work. I wanted to go the extra mile. And so when I see your stats of, a lot of people want, a lot more remote, I don't know, maybe that's right. Maybe they're not really engaged. Maybe that leader isn't, bringing out that energy. And maybe they're not bringing out that, I want to do more. I want to go, go, go. And so, I know this is a big part of leadership, as you mentioned. That's number one. I think the challenge for great leadership is bigger than ever in this kind of an environment, because you can't let go of, you must engage your employees. The more your employees are engaged, the better you're going to be able to, defeat your competition, because they're going to go the extra mile. They're going to have that extra energy. They're going to work better in a team because they have a leader that inspires them. And so I think part of the problem, and Tracy hit on this, is if you're remote and you're not really engaging the employees that are remote, I don't know what you have. You don't have a culture. You have mercenaries. That may work in certain businesses, but many, I think, lead to dismal failure. So I think the premium on leadership's actually increased in this environment by a lot.
Interesting. There was a quip from a CEO of a major corporation that kind of bridges what you're saying, where he pointed out, feel free to work at home and be remote all you want, but if you want a promotion, show up at work.
Yeah, so maybe I'm a bit of a contrarian. I totally agree with everything you're saying. And the number of marriages that are formed digitally, virtually, before they finally come together, it's like something's happening online. And I'm part of I'm one of those believers in God, and I'm in a church group that we used to meet. We've been meeting for 10, 12 years, a bunch of guys, maybe, I don't know, 10 of us. And we used to meet in person over breakfast, and it was great. And now we're meeting early on Friday mornings instead of over breakfast, Zoom. And I'm just not so convinced it's not just as good. It's just different. But we make the time. Maybe we're using virtual tools simply for productivity, and we can start to learn how to use them for building relationship as well as productivity. So I don't know. We'll find out. And Tom, I totally agree. I mean, in person, how can you beat being together when you've got a dynamic leader who casts vision and purpose?
That's the key. You think about it. I think we're all old enough to have understand what clock watching was and is.
Yeah.
And I think the beauty of hybrid work and working remotely is that's gone. There's the sitting at your desk till the boss leaves. I certainly had that experience at one point in my career. And I think thankfully that is gone. But I think the bigger issue, Roger, is that there are so many uninspiring leaders and so many people who kind of go through the motions. Tracy alluded to, somebody who does their checklist, they're not really engaging with the people remotely. Guess what? That person's ineffective online or in person. It doesn't make any difference. But as I said, I've been lucky enough to work with really dynamic, fabulous leaders. I got to tell you, I don't know how you replace that energy. Now that doesn't mean I have to be in there 5 days a week. I'm not saying that. I think the beauty of hybrid, when you have, I was lucky enough to work for people. If my children had a hockey game, they said, hey, go. But not all bosses do that. A lot of them are like, well, I don't know. We got a big staff meeting, something. But this kind of formalizes flexibility. And I think people crave flexibility. They want to be treated like adults. Paul, it's the same thing in a manufacturing environment. Yes, they'll never have remote work, but they can have flexibility. They can be treated like adults instead of you're a minute late from lunch, I'm docking you, 2 more occurrences and we're suspending you. I mean, that's idiotic. These are adults. These are human beings. So I don't disagree with you, Roger. I think these things can work in a lot of ways, but I do think the leadership premium is has never been higher.
Completely agree. And I would say it's more a matter of the heart than it is a matter of geography. Now,
Yeah.
geography might make it tougher, but if you have a heart of I am here, and we might get into servant leadership, but if I'm here to serve you, that's what I'm saying. I have more tools than ever, but I have to be driven by what can I do to help you, Tom, or Tracy, or whomever I'm working with, say, how can I help them today? And that's a matter of the heart. So, Tracy, we're not giving you much space, so I'm just going to.
No, I think these are great points. I've been thinking about how this is so much about the great sift of leadership. Like, I think the leaders who were always good at engaging and motivating and leading by objectives and managing by walking around, right, literally or figuratively, those are the leaders who have really risen to the fore, and they end up being models for where we're going. And then there are leaders who are just really struggling, but they're probably the leaders who were sort of under the water level when we had a high water level of everybody in the office every day. And I think that for me, a lot of the takeaway message of this conversation is intentionality. Like, there are absolutely things we can do brilliantly from home or a remote location. There are absolutely things we can do brilliantly, more brilliantly in person. And I really think a big part of this is a consciousness about our work. Like, what is the nature of the work that we're doing? What is the nature of our personal work style and preferences and what we need? What is the nature of the needs of the team and the organization? And how can we be planful and intentional about when we're together, about when we're face-to-face, about when we're not? You know, like if we've got the start of a team that doesn't know each other really well, that might be a great point for more face-to-face versus less. When we've got key gateways in our project, that might be a point for more face-to-face. If we've got conflict or difficulty or challenge or problem solving we want to work through. But there are other times when remote, to your point, Roger, can also work really well. So I do think this is a new moment for leadership in terms of shifts that leaders need to make, and a new moment for intentionality as we think about the work that we're doing, and not just the what, where, when, and how. Those are important details, but more interesting is the why for the organization and the why for people. And so that is our opportunity, is to be intentional, planful, and conscious about those choices that we're making, about how our location supports the work that we're doing.
Roger, let me go back and bridge off of your eHarmony comment. We have a young intern at Blackford who mentioned the other day that he's been involved in interviewing at companies that are doing the entire recruiting, orientation, initial training process online. And he's saying that the average tenure with that group is 6 months. That they don't form a connection. And what you said in your group of 10 gentlemen who meet is that you started together and then went remote. And maybe there's a message in there about during the time that you were together, the human connections will be made and they can be maintained electronically. But there's some message also in our interns' message about if you start me disconnected, it's hard for me to become engaged.
Right. Now, eHarmony, on the other hand, starts digital.
Yeah.
And leads in person. And so I don't have answers. I'm just really intrigued by what is it that allows that to happen? And can we learn some of those things that would help team bond? I think my preference, probably partly because of my age, is always, no, let's start together. But I'm intrigued by, I don't know what the numbers are, Paul, but the percentage of marriages these days that started digitally.
Can you imagine business going out and best practice sharing eHarmony, coming back to the boardroom with that one?
Might be innovative. I mean, creativity is one of the things we talk about.
That's it. One of the other big things about team, Roger, is this whole idea of communication, right? We had plant meetings before, we had meetings around the water fountain and things like that. And I think a lot about what you're talking about here is this intentionality around keeping people informed and communicating with them. In the kind of the groups that you've been working with or seeing, are there specific, and I think you've mentioned a couple times there, we've got more tools at our disposal than before. Are there specific things that you've seen be really effective for keeping people well informed and well engaged?
Yeah, I guess and this is probably a bent that I have, but I think so. Tom, you mentioned something I resonate with, and that's any study about culture and are you engaged? Do you like your place? Like, money is not high on the list. Communication is always, I want more communication. And then you talked about development. So I think what's most important isn't the techniques, it's that the leaders really get how incredibly important great communication is. And I personally think a lot of leaders aren't, I don't know if they're just not wired that way, but it's like, oh yeah, it's something I have to do, and they check the box. Like, no. This is a huge piece of what makes you the kind of leader that Tom was talking about, that he had that leader. And so, one, I want people to really understand this is incredibly important. And secondly, it's incredibly hard. When I write that great email that's written just so perfectly, and I send it out, and I think that's great communication, I'm kind of an idiot, because communication is just not easy. And so I think if you understand that, then you can start to look at, here's some tools I have. And I don't know who coined the phrase that important things need to be communicated 7 times in 7 different ways. Boy, that's a lot. But maybe we could do 4 times, 4 ways, if it's really important. And so it's less about the tools that we have and that I see our clients using, and more we're trying to help them say, what are the tools and how could you communicate something important more ways and more times. So I'd love to hear what any of you what that stirred up, or what you might want to underline.
And maybe one in particular that I could kind of toss out there for the group to consider. In a really effective team, it's not just the leader communicating with the members.
Amen.
In truly effective team, it's members communicating to each other, right? And so I've seen a lot of stats about the number of Zoom calls and frequent check-ins for one-on-ones and kind of those sort of things. But what have you heard about member-to-member communication, and how do we keep them connected for purposes of support and problem solving and the like?
Yeah, so I'm going to see
point.
if Tom and Tracy have any thoughts before I say anything. So Tracy.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was, as you were talking, Roger, I was thinking about a brilliant leader I worked with years ago, and he used to say, if I'm not completely sick of hearing myself talk about it by the end of the day, I haven't talked about it enough, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And by talk about it, he meant verbally, he meant written, he meant video, he meant hallway conversations, all of those kinds of things. And I think your point's a great one, Paul, around team members as well. I always like to think about hologram thinking versus puzzle piece thinking. Puzzle piece thinking, each of us have a piece, but we can't see the whole unless we come together and put the puzzle together. Hologram thinking is we all have as much information as there is to have appropriately, and therefore we can be proactive. And I think a big part of that is hearing from different points of view on the team. I think the other thing that's really important for us to consider is the deluge of information right now that's coming at people, and the extent to which people are looking to leaders to be a single source of truth, quote unquote, right? Like, there's so many different sources and I don't know what to pay attention to and I'm overwhelmed. So I increasingly look to my leader to say, all right, how does this thing that's happening outside of the company matter to the company, matter to my job, matter to our future? And so leaders have a lot of pressure. Neurologically, we prefer certainty and we tend to shy away from ambiguity. And so I think leaders have this new role to play in not trying to provide certainty, but providing clarity. And that might mean, here are the questions we're asking. Here's what we think, but we're not sure about. Here's where we'd like your input and participation. Here's what we know. Here's what we're investigating. Like, I think that leaders need to resist the temptation to provide certainty in communication, because in a lot of cases, we may not be able to. If we can, great, but if we're not able to, then clarity is the next thing. And that demonstrates a level of trust, that level of transparency. Sorry, Roger, you were going to jump in as well.
No,
I
I'd
know
love to
Tom
hear
needs
from
to jump
Tom.
in.
I'd love to hear from Tom.
I mean, this is a very deep and complicated subject, and you said the jury is still out. One of the things I know about business to be true is that ultimately you look at the bottom line over time, because that's how you're measured. You could look at a million ways, but ultimately that's the way the board and the CEO begin to look at things. And I think the hybrid work model is a good one. I think it'll work. I think it's here to stay. But over time, we're going to figure out what is the best way to attract the best people, how to engage the best people so they don't become mercenaries and leave, and how to grow great leaders in a new environment. But ultimately, businesses are going to keep experimenting, and if they find that their business model isn't working, they're going to change. And they may go back more towards what we're used to. They may go back the other way. My guess is hybrid will be here to stay in some form. I think, for example, if you work in a major metropolitan area, let's say LA, New York, Chicago, et cetera, and you can work at home on Fridays, I think that's a huge benefit. I think it keeps people from, getting on the train, et cetera. When I see people, companies, their workforce says, I don't want to come back. I can't believe we have to come back. And a large portion of your workforce wants to stay remote. I think that's an indictment on the culture. And nobody's going to convince me otherwise. We can talk about, all these different things. But ultimately, if they don't want to come back to work at all, my gosh, what kind of culture do we have? Work is a very important part of our well-being. It gives us self-esteem. There's a lot of pieces that are important to the human condition. Doesn't mean you have to be in the office every day. I'm not saying that. But ultimately, that jury that's out is not going to be out forever, Paul. They're going to come in a big way. And there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And people are going to have to figure out what is the right model. The one thing that won't, we've all said this, I think Roger and Tracy said, ultimately, and you said it, the team with the better leaders is going to win.
Yeah.
Well, let me bridge that, because I think that's an interesting, you were kind of going down the route. And from a company point of view, in order for there to be some logic or some sort of structure, I've been hearing a lot of companies asking about, well, how do we put policies around this? We got to give guardrails for what people should expect about remote. How do we make certain that some people aren't taking 5 days and some people are taking 3, and we start feeling inequitable between the groups? And this even gets at the question of the production workers who don't have the option and the knowledge workers who do. Where are we going with policy, and what are the principles that ought to be applied to how a business creates guidelines to think about how they allow their workers to work remotely?
I'll go last this time.
Well, I mean, look, I think it depends on what level worker you're talking about. So let's just talk about, the salaried workforce for a minute. I think you have to be careful with policies, because that's a major distraction as that week works its way through the company, and it can get a little big brotherish. In other words, do we want to measure how much time you're actually on your computer? And companies can do that, by the way. It's very easy to do. So you can say, Tracy's been on her computer 1 hour the last 3 days. That has culture implications. In the end, you want Tracy engaged enough that she's giving you her best effort because she cares. And so my own opinion is you have to be really, really careful with policies. I think that you use the common sense approach, you trust your people to some degree, and when somebody's not delivering, you discuss it with them, and if they don't deliver again, then you deal with it just as you normally would. But I think, Paul, it can be a major organization distraction as you sit down, especially think about an organization like Lear with 160,000 plus people. You start putting policies together and bridge all the cultural pieces in Europe and then in Asia and in the US. My God, you're going to be spending hours that could be focused on how you win the competition on policies. And you have to ask yourself, is that a good use of time? Because trust me, it will take hours and hours and hours to develop those policies.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about kind of the principal level. We've seen such a continuum in terms of how organizations are handling how much time people are working, how their work is
Right.
measured, how their work is being managed. And some organizations are Wild West, right? Come when you want to come, gee whiz, do what you want. We don't want to make anybody mad. And while that may seem wise because you aren't losing people because they're angry, I also think it's not very empowering, and it can put middle managers in a really difficult place because now they're managing on a one-off basis. And it can also be a source of less equity. And so I think that, to your point, Tom, we don't want to over systematize, but I really like a practice where we have overall principles about where we're working and how we're working. Like, oh my gosh, we always put the customer first, or oh, we always think about what are the team needs, or oh, we're always about the individual first and what your well-being is. Whatever those principles are that will help guide our work, and then individual teams can make choices and decisions. And I think another best practice is more explicit team norms and transparency among teams. Like, boy, let's all be together on Tuesdays and Wednesdays because we really work together those days. And maybe even these two departments want to be face-to-face on those couple of days, but there's more flexibility outside of those days. The other thing that I think is really interesting to consider here is just the idea of how much we want to rely on accountability. Like, it's actually a really good thing if people are held accountable. And I think we've gotten to this place with all the press about quiet quitting that we worry about being too firm. And actually, accountability is really empowering. I want to know that my work matters enough that you're going to hold me accountable to deliverables. I want to know that I have enough value that you want my brain in the room, literally or figuratively. And so recognition and performance management are two sides of the same coin. And I think we can feel good about holding people accountable, about giving them feedback, about helping them learn and develop and grow, about giving them ideas about how they could be even better than they are today. And to do that relatively unapologetically, because that is servant leadership in terms of supporting people and helping them grow. But Roger, you weigh in too.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So I'm probably going to be saying the same things, but just in a different language. But I also think that be careful with policies. Be very intentional with clarity, to go back to something you said, Tracy, which I so resonate with. Just because there may not be a lot of policies, you still have to be clear, what do you expect? And then I think a tool that is becoming more and more powerful, and it's basically, in the executive coaching world, we don't tell anybody what to do. We ask a lot of questions and help them find out what they believe they should do. And then we ask questions that will help them hold themselves accountable. And so I think it'd be the same thing here. It's like, so here's what we need. Here's what we've hired you for. Here's what we need from all of our. So what do you think will be important for you this week to focus on and get done? And then I'll check with you next week on how you think you did. And so there is accountability. And a great leader I know is Doug Conant, wrote a book called Touch Points. And Doug has this term that says, tough on standards, tender-hearted with people. And so it's this tense, and Tom, I know you led this way. I'm just getting to know you now. But it's like, no, you've got to do what you've got to do. But I'm going to do whatever I can to help you, and I'm going to understand when things aren't. It's like, so you have to be tender-hearted, but you have to hold people to standards. And in this case, I'm saying they would even set the standards, assuming that I align with them and go, yep, that will work. I hope you have a great week. I'm going to check with you next week, see how you did on what you said would be a great week. So those are my thoughts.
When the pandemic started and everybody got sent home, there was a survey done of managers, and the majority of the managers reported that they expected remote work to produce a decline in productivity. Okay, well, that hasn't exactly happened, but what they did because of that is a lot of them imposed a lot of KPIs, kind of metrics on people for what they expected them to kind of get done, and a lot of micromanagement started happening with daily calls and things like that to see, did you get done today what you're supposed to do? I think that it's an interesting thing to think about is that there's nothing inherently wrong with a KPI so long as what it is that's used for learning. You know, Peter Drucker said, "Control the work, not the worker," right? Which is a great kind of line. But I think that you know, when we first set people kind of home and we had to trust that they were going to get things done, we would put a lot of micromanagement controls in place. And what I hear you guys saying is that be clear about results, which is a form of communication that's imperative, that you come to an agreement about what is it that you expect to get done, and then be in a position to follow up. And I would imagine that you would also advocate available for support and help along the way as needed, but trust that they'll stay attentive to the outcome. And that's the managing for results portion that we've got to focus on. It's not butts and seats time, it's outcomes that the knowledge worker needs to focus on, right?
Yep. Yep.
That's right.
Okay. You also jumped into the question of accountability, which I like. The accountability is to the work, you know, not to the boss, right? And I think that was a good distinction. That's probably one of the things that leaders need to begin to experience in this remote world as well. Just to kind of, we're getting closer to the end here. And so one topic that I did want to touch on was this question of the decline in creativity. Creativity really, you know, talks a lot about being at risk because you're taking risks with ideas or thoughts or things like that. And there's a lot of concern that creativity is something that absolutely is a team sport, requires people to be present with one another. Is that how you guys are experiencing it? And what recommendations would you have for everyone on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we think about creativity as the divergent process, right? We're in a room, we're brainstorming, and we have lots of colorful Post-it notes, and that is part of the creative process. But we know that creativity also is sort of an in and out process as well, right? We've got to have some time to mull. We've got to have some time for incubation. And so I think we're also really smart to think about the various parts of the creative process. And some of those are face-to-face best. Some of those might be team best, even if we're not face-to-face. Some of those might be individual. But the other element of creativity and productivity that I like to think about is the relationship between psychological safety and comfort and discomfort. I think we have lots and lots going on in the press right now about creating psychological safety. And we want to do that. We want people to be able to kind of show up and bring their eclectic sense of humor, bring themselves, you know, be as fully themselves as they can so they can add to the creative process. But that is not the same as comfort and discomfort. So you can think of any good sociologist can make up a 2x2 model, right? But if we think about psychological safety, high, medium, low, and then comfort and discomfort, high, medium, low, how do we create space where people feel like they can take risks because they feel safe at a personal level? And how do we push ourselves? How do we foster healthy and constructive disagreement? How do we foster really appropriate discomfort where we're pushing ideas and pushing for innovation and making space for that crazy brainstorm? And how do we, in that 2x2, have a high level of psychological safety that allows us to take really important and appropriate risks toward creativity and innovation? And I think that's part of that leadership role. I heard a great quote lately: there cannot be creative space or time unless there is safe space. And to me, that speaks to that psychological safety piece. But when leaders are creating cultures of trust and respect, creating cultures of servant leadership, creating cultures where people feel like they can bring their best, then I think that frees us for more creativity and pushing the boundaries and taking appropriate risks and being comfortable with more discomfort. How do others feel?
I would just say real quick in 30 seconds that, again, I think there are tools. I think it's easier in person. It's more natural in person. I'm not convinced, however, that if I'm not intentional, that I might not be able to create that vulnerability kind of safe space and follow the processes of creativity, which there's some great, just simple processes out there. I think you could do that at a distance. I prefer to do it in person, but I believe the tools are there.
Yeah, Andy Grove said, you know, what a leader's role is to understand all the things that are going on and connect the dots to their business. And I think that's right, actually. And so, I think creativity doesn't happen without deep knowledge. Creativity doesn't come out of thin air, right? So, I was at PepsiCo. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, the flaming hot Cheetos and things that are very spicy. Well, that came out of drivers who went into urban areas and saw that the people that they were serving really liked spicy snacks. So that was extremely creative, but that doesn't happen by, I don't want to pick on you, Tracy, but a safe space or whatever. What that happens is I have very, very deep knowledge. And I say, what if I connect this dot to my business? And so again, it comes back to having leaders that keep you engaged so that you go deep into whatever you're doing. And the better you know a subject, the more likely it is you'll come up with some sort of a breakthrough. Breakthroughs, I could not make a breakthrough in, Tracy, your business or yours, Roger. I don't know it. I'm a creative person, but how would I do that? Now, if I worked there for 6 months and got to know what you're doing and went deep, or you did that with my business, I'm sure you could be a lot more creative. So I think, again, in a hybrid work, I don't think any of these things are issues. I think they all work because it's just more flexibility. But I think when you get to the remote piece where nobody wants to come in and all that kind of stuff, then I think you're going to run into a lot of issues, cultural issues, business issues. That's not for everybody. There's some technical things that work brilliantly on a computer. You could be in Alaska doing them. They'd work fine. But for things like creativity, etc., you need deep knowledge. You're going to get that knowledge by working with great people in an engaging atmosphere. That's what I believe.
All right, we got 3 minutes left. So I'd like to ask each of you, thinking about all the data we shared and the things that we've had an opportunity to talk about today, what's the single most important piece of advice you would give leaders today? What's your one pearl? Tracy?
Oh, I was going to volunteer to go last on this one. I think one of the things that we have to really, really do is push ourselves as leaders. Our algorithms work way too well, and we get tons and tons of information that agrees with how we already think. And I think we need to do a really good job of looking for different information, new information, fresh information that will surprise us and confront us. And I think when we can really bring in that new perspective, we can be better for it.
Okay. Roger?
So I think the importance of purpose, being clear about why is our department even here, and helping people understand how they fit in the total picture. And then realizing your job as a leader is to help them live into that purpose and start to realize we can't do it the way we used to do it. Another thing we didn't talk about, there's a power shift that has been happening between those at the top and with the talent war and the technologies. Like, these people don't have to do what you say anymore. So there's this really interesting mix of, you really do need to be there to serve them. They have the power a lot more than they ever used to. So that's what I'd say.
Tom?
That's great. What I would say is, look, leadership, no matter what environment you're in, is a constant. It's what separates the winners and the losers in business. And we talk a lot. We've had a lot of things that focus on individuals, but in the end, every business that you're in, especially today, is really hard. The competition is fierce. The chance to survive even is hard. I mean, to get funding, to do all these things, it's hard to win in business. And the way you win is to have great leaders. And I think what leaders need to recognize is this new environment, which I do think is here to stay in some form, puts a bigger burden and more challenge on leaders. How a leader was defined as a great leader 10 years ago versus how it's going to be defined, it's probably got some different attributes. So recognize the change is here to stay, recognize your role's never been more important, and recognize ultimately the culture that you're shaping with your leadership, whether you're dealing with remote people or people in a hybrid environment or just day to day, it's a difference maker. And so if you can step up to that challenge, you're going to thrive. And if you don't, you and your company are going to fall behind, because your competitors, somebody's going to be the winner.
it's a great way to kind of wrap it back to the beginning, that leadership has always been a function of the people that they lead. You know, that what makes an effective leader is a clear understanding of the needs of those people. And that's why it's evolved. That's why it's changed. And here we sit at another opportunity for that change. COVID forced it upon us, and it came here pretty quick. But it's interesting to reflect on kind of what the principles are. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and Tracy, Tom, and Roger, thank you very much for taking your time today to share your experiences, your thoughts, and your passions with everyone. And I hope everybody walks away with a kernel or two that they can put to work tomorrow. So from Blackford and
Roger,
all of my
Tracy, you guys
colleagues
were
here.
great. Thank you,
Yeah,
Paul.
thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed our webinar. Audience members, please remember to check your inboxes for an email to today's link. It will have your recording. It would also have the survey you will need to fill out to get your CE credits. I just want to thank our panelists again. Thank you guys for coming, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon.
All the best.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey,